All right, so welcome back. So in this part, we are going to look at some gross anatomy, so some gross anatomical features and parts of our spinal cord. We'll look at some spinal nerves and nerve plexuses, and then we'll end by talking about the structure of our brain. So to begin, when we look at our spinal cord is the really the continuation, the inferior continuation of our brainstem, and specifically the medulla, continuing inferiorly out of the foramen magnum. So if you recall, the foramen magnum is that opening in the occipital bone of our skull. As that brainstem continues down, it continues as our spinal cord. Now, on either side of the spinal cord, we have what are called rootlets, or spinal nerve roots. So these roots are what you can see right here. So you can see this root right here where my cursor is. You can see this other one right here, and then you can see two on the left side of our screen as well. So what these roots are ultimately what are going to kind of merge together and form what is known as our spinal nerve. But these roots are bringing information either into the spinal cord or they are bringing information out of the spinal cord. So the posterior root, sometimes referred to as the dorsal root, is bringing sensory information into the spinal cord. Right? So it is carrying afferent fibers, afferent information from the periphery, right? So from the skin, from muscles, from any type of sensory receptor, ultimately back to the central nervous system. So our spinal cord is part of our central nervous system, right? So when you think of the posterior root from now on, you should begin to think of afferent information. You should begin to think of sensory, right? So if the posterior dorsal root is sensory, then the anterior root, sometimes referred to as the ventral root, is purely motor, or it is purely efferent information originating in the central nervous system, so originating in the brain, in the spinal cord, and flowing out into the periphery, so out to some effector, so a gland, a muscle, something like that, all right? So whenever we look at this, we see that we have this posterior root, we have the anterior root. As a part or a feature of our posterior dorsal root, we have something known as the dorsal root ganglion, sometimes called a posterior root ganglion. So if you recall, we mentioned in a previous part of this lecture that a cluster and a clumping together of cell bodies inside the central nervous system is specifically known as a nucleus. All right. So when we have that same thing, we have a cluster or a clumping of cell bodies, but now it's outside the central nervous system, we're going to call that a ganglion. So hopefully you can see here, right around here where my cursor is, there's kind of this large swelling, and you can see it on the left side, and you can also see it in this superior image up here. This large kind of swollen bulbous structure, this is called a ganglion. And this one is specifically our dorsal root ganglion, or a posterior root ganglion. What this contains is it contains cell bodies of our sensory neurons, right? And this should make sense because we said earlier that our posterior root is composed of purely sensory or afferent information, right? So this dorsal root ganglion is the location of our sensory neuron cell bodies. So if you look at the superior image, all of these small little white dots that you see, these clusters, these are all of those sensory neuron cell bodies that are aggregated and clumped together and clustered in this dorsal root ganglion, right? So if you recall, we talked about different types of neurons in the previous part, and our sensory neurons are specifically known as unipolar neurons, okay? So whenever we continue a little more laterally in the spinal cord, and we see that we have our roots, and the roots at one point kind of come together and merge, and this is known as our spinal nerve. Okay, so you may think, or it may be obvious to you now, or intuitive, that if our dorsal root contains purely sensory information, and our ventral root contains purely motor information, and at some point these two roots fuse and they merge, so we have a dorsal root and the anterior root coming together, then it would kind of make intuitive sense that that thing that where they come together, the spinal nerve, is going to contain both sensory and motor information, and that's exactly what we see. So sensory and motor neurons are in each spinal nerve, and so these are classified as mixed nerves. Mixed meaning they have both sensory and motor function. So if you look at the palm of your hand, if you're looking at your right hand, the palm of your right hand, at the base of your thumb on your palm, there should be kind of a large, kind of meaty pad of muscle, and it's covered by skin, right? So right at the base of your thumb, this large kind of pad of muscle. The skin over this meaty pad of muscle, this is innervated. So if you can touch it and scrape it, and you can feel that, that is being transmitted to your central nervous system ultimately by what's called the median nerve, which is the nerve of the brachial plexus that we'll talk about in a second. Now, if you take your thumb and you move your thumb across your palm or over to your pinky, like you're opposing your thumb and your pinky together, so your first and fifth digits, if you are able to do that and move your thumb across your palm, then that is being accomplished by those muscles, and those muscles are being innervated by that same nerve, the median nerve. So this is a good example of how our nerves, our peripheral spinal nerves, can have both a sensory or an afferent function along with a motor or an efferent function as well. So when we look at some more gross anatomy of the spinal cord, now we're looking from a superior view, looking down onto the spinal cord. We see our meninges, right? And the meninges are the same meninges that we found surrounding our brain that we discussed in the previous part, right? Or in a previous part. So if you recall, surrounding our brain, we had the dura, we had the arachnoid, and we had the pia mater, right? And so we'll see those exact same layers around the spinal cord in the exact same orientation. So around our brain, we had the pia was the most deep. Our arachnoid mater was just superficial to that, and then our dura was just superficial to that. We see the same orientation around the spinal cord. So first we have our pia mater, right around the circumference of our spinal cord. We have our pia mater, and if you recall, pia meant thin and delicate. So this is that thin, delicate layer that is on the surface of the spinal cord, just like it was on the surface of the brain. If we go one layer superficial, we get to our arachnoid mater, right? Arachnoid meant spider-like or web-like, and this is just superficial to the pia mater. If you recall, around the brain, we had a region deep to the arachnoid mater known as the subarachnoid space. And the subarachnoid space is also present surrounding the spinal cord, and it serves the same function, and it circulates and contains cerebrospinal fluid surrounding our spinal cord. So surrounding our spinal cord, this subarachnoid space in the CSF lends itself to being usable and very important clinically for things known as a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. And so we've mentioned briefly in a previous lecture about meningitis. And so we said meningitis was the inflammation of the meninges. And one way you can test for and diagnose or rule out meningitis is to take a sample of the cerebral spinal fluid, right? So if you're needing to access and get a sample of the cerebral spinal fluid, and you're getting it in the spinal cord, well, what space are you going to go into? Well, we know we're going to go into the subarachnoid space. And so a needle can be inserted in a clinical setting into the subarachnoid space, usually in the low lumbar region, so maybe between like L1, L2, or L2, L3, L3, L4, something like that, maybe L4, L5. Insert it into that subarachnoid space and aspirate a little bit, or kind of draw out a little bit of CSF. You've collected it, you can send it off to the lab, they can test it, see if there are any viruses, if there's any bacteria, and that can diagnose or rule out possible meningitis. Okay. So lastly, we get to our dura, and again, the dura is the most superficial layer, just like we saw around the brain. The main difference between the dura around the spinal cord and the dura around the brain is, if you recall, around the brain we had the dura split into kind of two sublayers, and that created those dural venous sinuses, or those blood vessels essentially in the skull, that allowed blood to be drained along with the CSF to be returned to the blood. Well, surrounding our spinal cord, we do not see that. We just have a single layer of dura. So we have our spinal cord here. We have one layer of dura that goes all the way around, but there is no dural venous sinuses. So in other words, the dura around the spinal cord is one continuous layer. And again, it's the most superficial. Now, you do have some potential spaces in regards to the dura, or relative to the location of the dura, and these are called the subdural and the epidural spaces. Okay, and so these are largely potential spaces, meaning there's not really a large space there, but there could be if something were to collect there. And so you can have things called subdural hematomas and epidural hematomas in which blood collects in one of those areas, and then you can see that on a CT scan. You can see that very obviously in the epidural and subdural hematomas look slightly different on a CT image. So that would be one way to diagnose a subdural or epidural hematoma. So whenever we look at the spinal cord, we can see all these things that we've talked about. We can see our spinal cord itself. We can see dorsal root. We can see anterior root. Now, if we were to remove all of these labels, so just put a blank picture of a spinal cord with the roots and the ganglion and the nerve and all that, with no labels, how would you know which side is anterior, which side is posterior, and how would you be able to orient yourself? So look at this for a second, pause the video if you need to, and look at it and think, okay, there's one key feature that you can look at and it will tell you, okay, this is anterior and this is posterior. So pause it, think about it, and I'm going to continue. So one thing you can look at is the location of that dorsal root or posterior root ganglion, right? So if you see this large mass, you see this large swelling, which you can see right here. You can also see down here, and you can kind of see it protruding through the dura right here. When you see that large mass, you know that you are looking at the dorsal root ganglion, and that is a part of your dorsal root. So if here is our dorsal root ganglion, well, this must be the dorsal root, and where it enters the spinal cord, that must be the dorsal or the posterior part of the spinal cord, and that's exactly what we see. So this other root here, this has to be the anterior or the ventral root, so this has to be the anterior portion of the spinal cord. Okay, so begin to orient yourself to images whenever you see them in models and whatnot in lab, and this will help you key in and identify different structures a little bit easier. And using this to help you identify anterior and posterior will also be helpful in what we're going to talk about next with regards to this area in here called our gray horns. So we have a posterior, we have a lateral, and we have an anterior gray horn. So when we look down on the spinal cord, so here we are looking down on our spinal cord, we have an H-shaped or kind of a butterfly-shaped region of gray matter within our spinal cord. So think back to what we talked about in the previous part of this lecture and think about what is gray matter, right? So hopefully you remember that gray matter is composed of all of the unmyelinated parts of an axon or of a neuron or unmyelinated axons themselves. Okay, so this includes things like our dendrites, our cell bodies, like we said, the unmyelinated axons themselves, and there are certain neurons called interneurons that are largely unmyelinated, and then we can also have glial cells. So if you recall, glial cells are all of those cells of the nervous system that are not neurons. So ependymal cells, microglial cells, oligodendrocytes, Schwann cells, all of those. Okay, so we have this mass of gray matter in the middle, this kind of H-shaped or butterfly shape, and there are different what are called horns to this structure. So we have a posterior horn or a dorsal horn, we have a lateral horn, and we have an anterior or ventral horn. All right, so we said that the posterior root ganglion contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. The dorsal or posterior root contains sensory information. So where that sensory information enters the spinal cord is this dorsal root. So those sensory axons extend from the dorsal or posterior root into that dorsal horn here. Okay. The anterior horn is going to be the location where we find our motor neuron cell bodies. So the cell bodies of our somatic motor neurons, they're going to be housed and they're going to be located in our ventral root. So they're going to be located right here, kind of in this red region that we see. And if you zoom in and you look right here, there is a somatic motor cell body, motor neuron cell body. So this last one, the lateral horn is not found in every region of the spinal cord. It is only found in areas where we have what's called sympathetic outflow, meaning sympathetic neurons emerge from the spinal cord at these certain levels. And this is everywhere from the first thoracic segment of the spinal cord down to the second lumbar. So T1 to L2, this is where we have sympathetic outflow. This is where we find the what are called preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. So we'll see that our sympathetic nervous system is always a two-neuron pathway. There's what's called a preganglionic, and there is a postganglionic neuron. the preganglionic neuron's cell body is found in the lateral horn. So like you see here, cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons, specifically what's called the preganglionic neuron. And we'll talk about preganglionic and postganglionic and ganglions and all of this other stuff whenever we do our autonomic nervous system lecture. So all of these nerves that we've mentioned, or this idea of a nerve that we've mentioned coming off the spinal cord, we have different numbers of spinal nerves in different parts of our spinal cord. Okay, so we have, just like our named vertebrae, we have cervical vertebrae, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. We also have the same named spinal nerves. So the spinal nerves in the cervical region are called cervical spinal nerves. Those in the thoracic are called thoracic spinal nerves, so on and so forth. Okay, so if you think about the number of vertebrae in our spine, the number of spinal nerves is the same number as the number of vertebrae, with one exception. Okay, so if you think about how many lumbar vertebrae we have 5 vertebrae, so we have 5 nerves. In our thoracic region, we have 12 vertebrae, so we have 12 nerves. In our cervical region, however, we have 7 vertebrae, but we have 8 nerves. So what turns out to have happened is that during development, we had what was, you could kind of think of at one point was going to be an 8th cervical vertebrae. But instead of becoming a vertebrae, it fused with the base of the skull, so with our occipital bone, and became part of the skull and is not a vertebrae. So in turn, we have 7 vertebrae, but we have an additional named nerve, so we have 8 nerves. So what this means for the direction or the location of the nerves is that the first 7 spinal nerves, so the cervical, travel on above or superior to their named vertebrae. So the first cervical vertebrae, the first cervical nerve goes on top of it. You go down to the third cervical vertebrae, the third nerve goes on top, all the way down to the 7th, and the 7th nerve goes on top. After you finish this, or you have the 7th cervical vertebrae, you go to the first thoracic. But we have an extra cervical nerve. So you have your C7 vertebrae. The 8th cervical nerve goes underneath that 7th cervical vertebrae, and so it goes on top of the first thoracic. So that means that the first thoracic spinal nerve goes underneath the first thoracic vertebrae. So from there down, from the first thoracic down, the named spinal nerve goes underneath the named vertebrae. So the T3 spinal nerve goes under the T3 vertebrae. The T12 spinal nerve goes under the T12 vertebrae. The L3 spinal nerve goes under the L3 vertebrae. Okay. So if you remember that we had what was, you can kind of think of was, it was going to be an 8th vertebrae, 8th cervical, but didn't, results in this kind of change in the orientation of the nerves with respect to the actual vertebrae. Okay, so in total we have 31 spinal nerves in total, pair. So we have 62 in total, and these emerge from the spinal cord. So we have our anterior root, our ventral root. This forms a spinal nerve, and then from the spinal nerve we have what are called rami, or something called a ramus. And a ramus is just a branch. Okay, so a ramus is just a branch of something. So we have spinal rami, anterior ramus, or a dorsal ramus, posterior ramus. These are just branches off the spinal nerve. And these rami and these nerves kind of fuse together, and they intertwine, and they mix, and they join each other, and they form something called a plexus, or a nerve plexus. And these nerve plexuses are located in different regions of the spinal cord. So we have what's called a cervical plexus, we have a brachial plexus, we have a lumbar plexus, we have a sacral plexus. These are large masses of nerves, and you can see these named here. So here's a cervical plexus, here's a brachial, here's a lumbar, here's a sacral. These are large masses of nerves, all kind of intertwined and intermingled and fused together, that go out and supply cutaneous sensory information and motor innervation to different areas of the body. And so we'll look at these 4 in a little bit more detail. So the first one is known as the cervical plexus. So the cervical plexus it arises from the first 4 cervical spinal nerves, so C1, 2, 3, and 4, it provides sensory or cutaneous innervation to skin over the lateral side of our head, kind of our neck, and out onto our shoulder. So if you can feel behind your ear, if you can feel that, if you feel on your ear, if you feel anterior and inferior to your ear, if you feel down onto your neck and you feel out onto your shoulder, if you can feel all of that, then you have proper functioning of the sensory nerves from your cervical plexus. Okay, so these are things like we have one called the great auricular nerve, we have supraclavicular nerves, we have a transverse cervical nerve. These are all stretching out along the face, neck, and shoulder to provide it with sensory information, right? So we're feeling something, okay? We're sensing, we're perceiving it. Now, we also have one very important motor nerve. So motor meaning it's supplying an effector, it's supplying a muscle or something. And this is called the phrenic nerve. And the phrenic nerve is our motor nerve, or motor innervation supplying our diaphragm. So our diaphragm is the main muscle of respiration, right? So for breathing, so whenever we inhale, our diaphragm flattens down, it contracts and it flattens. That helps to increase the size of the thoracic cavity and allows us to bring air in, right? So the mechanics of breathing's more than that. It's a little more complicated, and you'll talk about that in future classes. So in AMP2, and you do respiratory system. But in general, that's the idea. And the main thing we're talking about here is that that diaphragm is innervated, and it has an innervation via the phrenic nerve. And the phrenic nerve comes from the C3, 4, and 5 spinal cord levels. So if you look here, here's our phrenic nerve, and if you go to this nerve and you trace back the branches, they go back to C3, C4, and C5. Okay? So what this means is that if you have an injury to the spinal cord at level C3, C4, C5, or above, so C1, C2, something like that, then you're likely to, or you're going to impair spontaneous ventilation. The reason you would impair spontaneous ventilation is because you're affecting the spinal nerves, or the spinal cord levels or above, that give rise to that nerve, right? So if you damage it, then of course you're going to have an altered flow of impulse, of action potentials of electricity out that nerve to that muscle, okay? So if you were to damage your thoracic spinal cord or your lumbar spinal cord or something like that, you're not going to affect your spontaneous ventilation or breathing because you've damaged the spinal cord below the level where that nerve originates. So you haven't affected that nerve. Okay. Now there is a nice mnemonic to remember the origin of the phrenic nerve, and it's C3, 4, and 5 keeps the diaphragm alive. So C3, 4, and 5, that is the origin, the spinal cord origin of the phrenic nerve. Phrenic nerve goes down, and when we say keeps the diaphragm alive, it keeps it innervated, it keeps it contracting. Okay. So the second plexus of nerves is called the brachial plexus. So the brachial plexus is probably the most commonly referred to nerve plexus. It's called so if you think about the brachial region region is referring to our arm. So our upper arm is the brachium, our forearm is the antebrachium. And so this brachial region, it is supplying skin and muscles of the arm and the hand and the fingers and whatnot. But it originates really in the neck. So it's from C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1 spinal cord levels. And it has 5 what are called terminal branches. Okay. Now there are lots of other branches, and this diagram here is an extreme oversimplification of the brachial plexus. So anatomists, we don't really like this picture because it's extremely simple. It's too basic. It doesn't really highlight the complexity, and I'll show you a picture in the next slide that will give a little bit better visual representation of it. But there are lots of things coming off the brachial plexus, but what you should be aware of are the 5 terminal branches. So these are these ones out here in green, and these are called the musculocutaneous, axillary, median, radial, and ulnar nerves. Okay, so if we look here, this picture shows it a little bit better. Okay, so you see those 5, you see musculocutaneous, axillary, median, radial, and ulnar. You can also see all these little branches kind of coming off at certain points. Those are all other branches of the brachial plexus that you don't really need to worry about at this point. Okay. You can also see that the brachial plexus is colored in different shades. So there's yellow, there's a gray, orange, blue, and green. This is representing the roots, trunks, cords, divisions here in blue, and then branches in green. Okay. So the only thing you should be aware of are those 5 terminal branches. And so if we go through these, the musculocutaneous nerve, this is going to innervate our anterior arm muscles. So things like our biceps brachii, our brachialis, our coracobrachialis, all those muscles there. Okay, our axillary nerve is going to get like our deltoid. Okay, so the way we're able to abduct our arm and extend it out is via the deltoid that's receiving innervation via the axillary nerve. We also have the median nerve. The median nerve innervates muscles of our forearm, our anterior flexor compartment of our forearm, as well as some skin and muscles in our hand, supplying our fingers. We also have the median nerve supplying a little bit of skin as well. We have the radial nerve. Radial nerve is getting our posterior arm and posterior forearm muscles, so primarily our extensors, so like our triceps, also a little bit of skin over the wrist and hand and fingers. And then we have the ulnar nerve. And the ulnar nerve is supplying, again, some sensory cutaneous regions of our palm and fingers. And it is also getting part of a muscle in the anterior forearm, the flexor compartment, and then it is getting most of the muscles, most of the small intrinsic muscles of our hand. Okay, so the brachial plexus is very, very important. Any type of kind of cervical injury, lower cervical nerve injury, a car accident, some type of physical trauma could damage the brachial plexus, and you'll see the effects, these deficits in the functionality and the sensation and perception in the upper extremity. Okay. So the third plexus we'll talk about is the lumbar plexus. So our lumbar plexus is emerging from L1, 2, 3, and 4 spinal cord levels, and it has a couple of main or a couple of large nerves. And one of these is the femoral nerve. So you think about where your femoral region is, like your thigh. This is where we have the femur. You also have this femoral nerve running in there as well. When you do AP2, you'll talk about blood vessels. You have femoral artery. You have femoral vein. Those are also running in this same region as well. So kind of in this anterior thigh compartment. The femoral nerve is supplying our quads. So we have 4 muscles that make up our quads. We have the rectus femoris. We have the vastus medialis, intermedius, and lateralis. All of these muscles are being supplied, as well as the sartorius as well, which isn't, it's in the anterior thigh compartment, but it's not part of the quads. All these muscles receive innervation via the femoral nerve, and this allows us to be able to extend our leg at the knee and flex our leg at the hip. Okay, so hip flexors and knee extensors. Okay. Now, the other nerve is known as the obturator nerve. So the obturator nerve is innervating muscles in our medial thigh compartment. So on the inside of your thigh, all of these muscles are known as the adductors. So we have adductor longus, brevis, magnus, one called gracilis. These are all serving to adduct the leg or the thigh and bring the leg back into the body closer to the midline. Okay, so this is accomplished via the obturator nerve. So you can see these two here. You can see the one large femoral nerve, it is the larger nerve, and then we have a smaller obturator nerve here. So our last plexus that we'll talk about is the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus has lots of little nerves, and again, or just to make a note, the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus are sometimes talked about together. So from L4 all the way down to S4, or L1 all the way down to S4 for both of these together. And then they're sometimes referred to as the lumbosacral plexus, and when they just combine them all. But here we're talking about them separately. So the sacral plexus is from L4 to S4. And the main nerve here, there's lots of nerves, but the main one is the sciatic nerve, okay, or the largest nerve in our body, the largest and the longest nerve. Now, the sciatic nerve runs in the posterior compartment of the thigh. So on the back of the thigh in our hamstring area. It provides innervation to those hamstring muscles, so for hip extension and knee flexion. And it also branches into what's called the tibial and the common fibular branches or common fibular divisions. These then go down and supply motor innervation to regarding muscles, to all of the muscles really below our knee. So we have an anterior compartment, we have a lateral compartment, and our posterior compartment. These two divisions are going to innervate the muscles in these groups. Now, if you look on this image to the right, You can see your sciatic nerve coming down, and you see it branches. It branches here into the tibial division on the left and this common fibular on the right. This common fibular wraps around the head of our fibula. And so a fibular head fracture from being hit, some type of trauma, some type of mechanical force, if you were to fracture that fibular head, there's a decent chance that at the same time you're also going to damage the common fibular nerve, and you're going to see deficits in the movement of the lower leg and of the foot as a result of damaging that nerve. Okay. Now, you may have also heard of sciatica or experienced sciatica or had a friend or family member who's experienced sciatica. And where do they typically complain of pain? Well, they typically complain of pain in the back of their leg, shooting, burning pain running down the back of their leg. It's because this is where we have our sciatic nerve, and it supplies some sensory information in that area. Okay. So we're going to stop here, and then we'll pick up with our last part, and we'll talk about some gross anatomy of the brain, look at some structural areas of the brain, and also some functional areas as well.